Early voting starts tomorrow across Texas. Voters will decide on 8 proposed amendments to the state's constitution. 2 of those amendments come in response to restrictions enacted in the state during the pandemic. Proposition 6 would make sure families could designate an essential caregiver to visit nursing home and assisted living facility residents. Avery Travis digs deeper into what led to this proposition and why families are fighting to make sure it passes.
For months, Mary Nichols and her mother were separated when the doors of her mother's nursing home closed to stop the spread of COVID-19.
She can't even turn her own head at this point. So she doesn't have any human contact if I'm not there, sitting there singing to her, talking to her.
That's why she started the group Texas Caregivers for Compromise, advocating for 2 designated family caregivers per resident to be allowed inside these types of facilities despite other COVID restrictions. And earlier this year, the Texas legislature agreed, writing that into law, with dozens of lawmakers from both sides of the aisle signing on their support.
I felt like we were saving the body but killing the spirit. We can never do that again.
Now, many of these lawmakers and family members like Nichols want to take it a step further.
When there is an emergency, when there is an infection control issue.
Senator Lois Kolkhorst wrote what's now a proposed amendment to the Texas Constitution, ensuring long-term care residents have the right to one in-person essential caregiver, even if we're in a state of emergency.
Laws can be paused. You can push a hold button on those laws. If it is a constitutional right, they cannot do that.
Nichols has seen a lot of support, including from the association representing Texas nursing homes. She says the biggest hurdle, though, is making sure people know it's on the ballot.
All of us will either be a caregiver, know someone who's a caregiver, or be in need of a caregiver. So this is something that's going to affect every single one of us.
Avery Travis for State of Texas.
During the peak of the pandemic last year, many churches shifted to online, outdoor, and socially distant services, but some local officials ordered churches to shut their doors. Proposition 3 would stop that from happening again in Texas. Maggie Glenn looks closer at the amendment and what's motivating people who want it to pass.
I just encourage every pastor truly to seek wisdom and counsel and to be able to look yourself in the mirror in the morning and say, I, to the best of my ability, did what I believed was right.
Religious leaders across the state had a tough decision to keep their doors open or closed to help stop the spread. But in some places, churches didn't have a choice.
We saw multiple local ordinances and other governmental entities shutting down churches,
which Republican lawmakers said reached too far.
The Constitution of Texas and the United States is very clear. The government should not shut down churches.
That's why they passed the bill that became Prop 3, barring any governmental entity from shutting down churches even in disasters or emergencies. The bill passed with bipartisan support, but some opposed the new law, saying the churches were ordered closed to protect public health and did not impede on religious freedoms.
If a fire marshal orders a number of people to leave a church building because it is currently overfull, that is not an infringement of anyone's right to exercise their religion.
The Constitution and case laws allow for reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on certain First Amendment rights, but this was much different. This was completely shutting down and foreclosing the opportunity to worship, and that's where government greatly overreached.
Maggie Glenn for State of Texas.
There are 6 other constitutional amendments on the ballot. Proposition 1 would let professional rodeo associations and charities have raffles at rodeo venues. Proposition 2 would give counties the power to issue transportation bonds to pay for infrastructure projects in underserved or deteriorating areas. There are 2 measures related to qualifications for judges and candidates running for judicial office. Proposition 4 updates eligibility requirements for Texas Supreme Court justices and other elected judges. Proposition 5 would let the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct investigate complaints against candidates running for state judicial office. And voters will decide on 2 proposed amendments pertaining to homestead taxes. Proposition 7 would allow the surviving spouse of a disabled person to keep a homestead limit on school district property taxes if the spouse is 55 or older. The Texas Constitution currently gives a homestead tax exemption to spouses of military members who are killed in action. Proposition 8 would expand that to cover military members who die in training or other military duties. History shows the decisions on the amendments will be made by just a small percentage of Texas voters. Here's a look at recent turnout figures. More than 11 million Texans voted in last year's presidential election. That's close to 67% of registered voters. It's a much different story for the constitutional amendment election in the year before. Fewer than 2 million voted in that election. That's just over 12% of turnout. Our Robert Hadlock reached out to the League of Women Voters in Austin to dig deeper into the turnout problems and the effort to get more people to vote.
I'm here with Valerie DeBill at the state capitol. She's with the League of Women Voters here in Austin. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
What are some of the challenges of getting people out to vote during an off-year election?
Primarily it's publicity. There's not as many commercials, there's not as many signs, there's not as many things going on. Also because they tend to be kind of dry. They're generally about issues and not people, and so you don't have that kind of associated interest, in speaking about actual human beings. In Austin, that's all we have is constitutional amendments and a couple of city propositions.
Consequently, who's being left out in the process?
The people it actually affects most of the time. Really, you get the propositions and the constitutional amendments are both proposed by people who feel strongly about the issue. And so they're going to have a very defined position. Whereas, things like the constitutional amendment I just mentioned about counties being able to raise infrastructure, that will affect your property taxes. And so if you don't realize that that's a follow-on effect, you might not realize that this actually affects you. And so, you don't bother to go to the polls.
What needs to happen to increase the turnout?
I think publicity would be really good. I think that knowing that it's happening, there's a lot of things that we see in voter registration where, just a couple of weeks ago, we registered people who were asking me, basically about 2022. They thought that was the next election because they didn't even know that there was one this year. And we had the same thing happen in 2019 where everybody was like, so this November is the presidential? And we're like, no, that's a totally different thing. It's a odd numbered years, even numbered years. It's not that hard to keep track of, but if you're not paying attention all the time, it's easy to lose track of.
Thanks, Robert. Your chance to vote begins in just a few hours. Early voting starts Monday and runs through Friday, October 29th. Election Day is Tuesday, November 2nd.
This has been the greatest disruption to our colleges and universities over this last year and a half that we've seen since the end of the Second World War.
Getting back on track in Texas, how universities and colleges are doing now after enrollment dropped during the pandemic. An update on our Colleges in Crisis investigation next on State of Texas.